Welcome to another installment of the Behavior, Evolution, and Culture seminar series. We are well into the winter quarter now, and the entire schedule for the quarter is up on the website, www.beck.ucla.edu. And if you haven't looked at it yet, it's our new and improved website. It's very beautiful, so take some time to check it out. To give you a preview, next week's speaker is our own Sarah Matthew, and she's going to be talking about warfare and the collective action problem in acephalous societies. So be sure to be here for that. And this week I am pleased to welcome Jason Clark, who's a visiting scholar at UCLA right now, but his home institution is the University of Osnabrueck. I only know that because I wrote it down phonetically, and he's going to be talking about serial homologies of psychological traits. So welcome.
All right, well, thanks for coming, and thanks to Leo for all his hard work in organizing this. It's a great forum for developing ideas with the hour-long talk rather than the usual 20 minutes. But especially with an hour-long talk, it's important to keep in mind the advice given by one of my favorite comedians, Mitch Hedberg, who says, as a comedian, it's important to start the show strong and end the show strong. You can't be like pancakes, all exciting at first, but by the end you're frickin' sick of them. So, unfortunately, the beginning of this talk is not going to be very exciting. All the exciting stuff is sort of backloaded. We'll start out with homology basics, then talk about homologizing basic and higher cognitive forms of emotion, shame, pride, disgust, and hopefully laughter. Then we'll talk about what I've called the persistence problem, the serial homology solution that I've offered for that, and then some problem solutions and possibilities. So, caveats, I've kept a lot of the references out just to keep the presentation clean. You can find them in papers on my website. Also, the slides are probably going to be a little richer than my verbal presentation. I assume most of you can read faster than I can talk, so please make it available to you. This is going to be a long talk. I hope to fit it into the hour. So if you have comments or criticisms, I'd ask you to save those to the end. If you want clarification, go ahead and ask during the talk. So homology. Owen defined homology in 1843 as the same trait under every variety of form and function. So these are traits that organisms share in common as a result of descent from a common ancestor. And these can cut across species and functional lines so that whale flippers and human hands are homologous despite the fact that they occur in different species and play different functions. So this contrasts with analogies, for example, where a trait plays the same function in different species despite the fact that they're not phylogenetically related. Standard homology slide, favorite homology slide. So why is homology useful? Homologous traits are likely to share deep commonalities at a number of different levels, so genetic, ontogenetic, etc., which allows for rich predictions and generalizations about them. It's nevertheless important to realize that these different levels of homology can be dissociated. So homologous traits can have different genetic, developmental, physiological, computational, behavioral, neural bases, and so on. So for example, the PAX6 gene underlies eye development in species ranging from fruit flies to humans, despite the fact that those eyes are not homologous. This is important to note, and it's relatively recent thinking within the homology literature, talking about homologies of function. You recall that Owen said homology is the same trait under every variety of form and function. So how can we talk about homologies of function? Well, in order to avoid the potential paradox there, function has to be construed either as causal role function, rather let's start with activity function, which is just the bare description of what something does, or causal role function, which is an account of the role that plays in a larger system. These are adaptively neutral. They're contrasted with adaptive notions of function like selective effect function, where, say, a trait's function is that which it has been selected for in the past. So I'll stop there for a second. Any questions about that? Maybe not. Maybe they'll come up later. So here I mainly want to use function in one of those two neutral senses. And that includes some of the social functions that I'll be describing, so that in talking about the social functions of emotions, I mainly just want to talk about the role that they play in a cognitive economy or social economy or whatever, whether they're adaptive or not. And let's see, yeah. So the concept of homology was originally designed to apply to anatomical structures, but it can also be extended to behavioral, psychological, or social structures. And there are at least 4 general criteria for distinguishing homologies. Special quality. The more special qualities a trait has, the less likely it is it evolved independently. Position. So the spatiotemporal position or functional role of a trait, and a more general pattern of organization. Continuity. So phylogenetic similarities. And shared developmental origins or mechanisms. The standard interpretation of homology, especially among non-biologists, is what's called transformational homology, in which the ancestral trait is transformed into the derived trait, but the derived trait is no longer present as such. So, for example, jaws into ears, forelimbs into hands, and so on. Moving on to serial homology, back to Mitch for a moment. I wrote a screenplay, but the editor said I had to rewrite it. I said, forget that, I'll just make a copy. All right. All right, I'm sure we've all wanted to say that to a reviewer at some point. So, serial homology. In serial homology, a trait is duplicated within a single organism, so for example, vertebrae. The ancestral trait remains present in its original form and function, and the duplicated trait can either augment the function of the original, or it can diverge from the original at multiple levels as a result of differences in its context or selective pressures on it. So this is sometimes called heterotrophy or heterochrony. Talk about augmentation. If you only have a couple Cheerios, it's not going to do you much good. If you duplicate those Cheerios, you're in business. More realistic example, one leaf might not help you very much, but a lot of leaves will. Homology, duplication and variation. So, Cheerios, duplicated in many ways and allowed to vary in those new contexts. More realistic example, leaves are duplicated and allowed to vary into flower petals. The leaves continue to exist and function as normal. So one reason that serial homology acts as a driver of evolutionary novelty is that the derived trait, the duplicated trait, can vary its function within the new context without disturbing the function of the original trait. And this helps to solve some of the problems associated with the development of traits, jumping local fitness peaks, and so on. So now we'll talk about homologizing basic and higher cognitive forms of various emotions, so starting with shame and pride. And by higher cognitive emotion, I just mean as an umbrella term to include those emotions. So basic emotions, these are things like Ekman's affect programs, fear, anger, joy, disgust, etc. The basic idea with these is that they're strongly biologically rooted, have a long phylogenetic history, and have elicitors and responses that are fairly stereotyped, rather than highly flexible. Higher cognitive emotions, on the other hand, are held to be evolutionarily recent and to basically be more involved and sensitive to cognitive and social factors. So people will say, for example, that pride requires a theory of mind, or even that pride is a socially constructed emotion. This division is maintained even by theorists with a strong biological orientation, despite the fact that there's been very little research into higher cognitive emotions. To some extent, this has a feeling to me of ceding territory in political negotiations with social constructionists, for example, we get the basic emotions and you can have the higher cognitive emotions. Ultimately, I think this depends on a faulty understanding of the relationships between biology and culture. As all of you well know, there's plenty of room for everyone. So, despite this, as far back as Darwin, there's a long tradition of trying to provide phylogenetic history and homologies of higher cognitive emotions, and this has seen a resurgence in recent years with the rise of the various evolutionary disciplines in psychology and anthropology. So, following authors like Fessler, I've argued extensively that many higher cognitive emotions have evolutionarily ancient basic forms that possess the characteristic necessary to consider them higher cognitive emotions. And despite undergoing significant transformations, these are homologous to the basic forms and retain many of their features. In other words, basic forms of these emotions can be evoked by cognitively simple elicitors. They have characteristic expressive and behavioral features, characteristic physiological responses, affective and cognitive sequelae, distinct phenomenological qualities, characteristic patterns of neural activity. Here I'll focus on shame and pride with briefer discussions of disgust and laughter. Essentially, though, I'm taking this homology claim as a premise. I'll flesh it out and provide some sketchy argument for it, but when we get to serial homology, I'll just be treating this as if it were so anyhow. So, shame, to consider just the behavioral or expressive features, involves shrinking posture, gaze aversion, face cover, flight, bent-kneed gait, avoiding social contact, and hiding. Pride, on the other hand, involves an expansive posture, head held high, small smile, chest out, shoulders back and squared, and arms raised in the fist or in some other expansive posture, crossed or on hips. So here we have gay pride. Here we have a closely related emotion, gay no shame. I look kind of like this guy, so I can get away with that. So, these expressive and behavioral features are morphologically similar to the responses seen in other animals in situations involving dominance and submission, and function in similar ways in dominance-based social dynamics to express appeasement or superiority. So, in pride, the increase in perceived size is adaptive by attracting attention to the individual and indicating that they deserve higher status or acceptance. In shame, the decrease in perceived size conveys recognition of others' dominance, acceptance of subordinate status, and serves to direct attention away from the actor in order to avoid aggression and preserve the status hierarchy without physical confrontation. So I think that in virtue of possessing all these features, these emotions can be considered basic emotions. Furthermore, given the robust similarities between these basic emotions and the emotions in humans, it's highly likely that these responses are homologous to those of humans. So, human social dynamics obviously continue to involve relatively simple dominance-based hierarchies. And in those contexts, these emotions largely play the same function that they do in other animals. We'll come back to that later. However, in humans, the functional breadth of shame and pride have expanded, and other emotions, in at least two ways, as a result of uniquely human cognitive capacities and social structure. So first, shame and pride have acquired the function of facilitating uniquely human forms of cooperation and conformity by signaling our awareness of our violations of collective norms, as well as our desire to adhere to them. Second, prestige competitions have largely replaced dominance in human society as the basis for ranking within a hierarchy, and shame and pride have come to be associated with losing or winning in such prestige competitions. Within cooperation conformity contexts, shame is transformed to communicate to the others that we are reliable partners for cooperative ventures. which facilitates cooperation with other members and enhances social reincorporation when we violated these norms. Pride, on the other hand, in prestige context occurs not as a result of dominating others coercively, but also as a result of aiding others, conforming to group norms, or performing supererogatory acts. So thus, an originally dominance-related emotion, pride paradoxically acquires the function of submitting to collective norms and contributing to collective goods in order to secure status. Prestige, as I'm guessing many or most of you know, as defined by Henrik and Gil White, performance status resulting from freely conferred deference, which involved to facilitate the transmission of information by cultural exchange. This involved non-agonistic exchange between individuals with differing assets, skills, or researchers, in which learners show deference to teachers in order to gain proximity and to emulate and acquire information from them. So full-blown prestige dynamics requires capacities for skill ranking of conspecifics, discriminatory deference, in other words, deferring to those who show high skill, and info copying, which involves at least minimally true imitation, but basically more generally refers to the ability to receive and transmit information through cultural lines. So, within these contexts, pride is associated with increased status resulting from high performance relative to social standards, and it's elicited in situations in which the actor succeeds in the performance of socially valued activities or acquiring socially valued goods. Shame, on the other hand, is associated with decreases in status resulting from failure relative to social standards and loss in prestige competitions. And this may be maladaptive. We'll come back to that later. So, nevertheless, despite being transformed within these new cognitive and social contexts, their physiological, expressive, and behavioral effects have been largely conserved in these more complex forms, in these more complex contexts. So individuals involved in shame or pride-relevant situations involving prestige competition or contexts of cooperation and conformity still show the behavioral, physiological, etc. responses associated with basic shame and pride, even when this is maladaptive or non-adaptive. So the presence of inherited traits that are maladaptive is one key criterion for recognizing homologies as opposed to analogies. They're simply inherited, they're kludgy. So thus, some central elements of basic shame and pride are conserved in the higher forms and also appear to play an adaptive role in the newly emerging prestige and cooperation conformity contexts. Despite these changes or expansions in function, they continue to arise in circumstances that are functionally highly similar and systematically related to those contexts in which they originated, considered at a higher level of description, so that of the dynamics of social hierarchies. Furthermore, these functions have altered to the extent and in the direction that these themes have developed in humans. So apes, for example, are more cognitively sophisticated than monkeys, possess some of the higher cognitive capacities in question, at least in rudimentary form, and these are reflected in the range and complexity of their affective responses, which points to an evolutionary continuity between basic and higher cognitive forms of these emotions. So, recalling the criteria for recognizing homologies, a strong case for homologizing basic shame with higher cognitive shame, same goes for pride, emerges. Characteristic features of these are conserved in higher cognitive forms. So these features are complex as well as distinct and specialized, so they constitute special qualities. They play similar functional roles in, at each of their respective organizational levels and in relation to one another, supporting the claim of positional or functional similarity. And finally, since these have evolved gradually and in response to different cognitive and social capacities in different species, this points to a continuity meeting all three criteria. And they also have, I think, some shared developmental mechanisms, which I'll address below. So, the persistence problem, getting to the serial homology material. What's especially relevant for present purposes is the fact that the basic forms of these emotions appear to persist independently to some degree alongside their higher cognitive forms and function largely as they originally did. So, for example, Fessler notes that adult humans still show shame responses simply by being in the presence of a higher ranking individual, which is a very cognitively simple assessment. One general reason to believe that basic emotions are preserved as such is that part of the rationale for basic emotions is that they're quick, modular, quick and dirty responses to urgent environmental circumstances. If you open these up to more higher cognitive influence, means on reasoning, and so on, that's going to slow them down, and it's going to make the reactions also slower. So, nevertheless, the fact that they do appear to persist is what I would call the persistence problem. So this is well illustrated, I think, by the evolutionary account of pride offered by Sharif, Tracy, Henrik, and Cheng. They argue that pride in humans is homologous with a more basic emotion in non-human primates, or rather apes. On their view, humans have two types of pride. Hubristic pride, which is associated with dominance-based status, and authentic pride, which is associated with prestige-based status. So according to them, they're not two distinct emotions, but rather what they call two facets of a single emotion, sharing a common indistinguishable expression and overlapping in some other broad respects, for example, lexical classification and appraisal structure. Despite these similarities, these two facets diverge significantly with respect to a large number of features: personality correlates, behavioral and social dynamics, finer-grained appraisal structure and lexical associations, physiological variables, and phenomenology. So, I'll move through this pretty quickly. They both involve attributions of success to the self, but they're differentiated according to whether they involve attributions of worth to internal, stable, global, uncontrollable factors, and that's hubristic pride, or internal, unstable, achievement-based, or act-specific, controllable factors, and that's authentic pride. They both fall into the general category of pride in lexical studies, but there are subclusters formed in those studies such that authentic pride is associated with words like accomplished, confident, productive, and HP is associated with words like arrogant, boastful, egotistical. Personality correlates. Authentic pride is positively correlated with self-esteem and many of the socially desirable and generally adaptive big five personality traits. Individuals high in dispositional AP tend to be low in depression, trait anxiety, etc. Whereas heuristic pride is negatively related to self-esteem, agreeableness, and conscientiousness, and is associated with greater shame proneness and narcissism. So, while Tracy et al. Note that pride promotes fitness regardless of whether the pride is experienced as authentic or hubristic, they also note that these distinct forms of status are attained through divergent behavioral patterns, and they claim that HP and AP were selected for in response to distinct evolutionary pressures to attain distinct types of status. So HP is associated with dominance and AP with prestige. And they further argue that with increasing reliance on prestige-based hierarchies, the kind of dominance associated with HP became increasingly dysfunctional. So what is the evolutionary relationship between HP and AP? Here are some quotes from them. It looks like, to sum them up, They think that some sort of dominance-related emotion as a precursor of pride exists in great apes, but that authentic pride, at the very least, is uniquely human because of the cognitive and cultural dynamics associated with prestige, which is generally held don't occur in other species. So this suggests the possibility that HP evolved first within the primate lineage as a means of navigating dominance-based status hierarchies, but with the rise of prestige hierarchies and uniquely human cognitive abilities, HP was modified to facilitate and communicate prestige-based status, resulting in AP. However, given that dominance hierarchies continue to play an important role in human life, the forms and functions of HP are retained in humans. This view of the evolution of pride clearly faces the persistence problem. I think I'll skip this. Parenthetically, they've responded to that suggestion by me by suggesting that both HP and AP are uniquely human, higher cognitive emotions that evolved from proto-pride predecessor, which is not present in human in its original form. I think that this response can be recalibrated to that, but I'm going to stick with the simple story here. So, Tracy and colleagues try to solve the persistence problem with the idea of facets, but I think the facet interpretation faces some strains. As Williams and DeSteno note, no other emotion is consistently viewed as having two distinct types of functionality based on different routes by which it fosters specific outcomes, although they also ultimately argue for a single trait view. Furthermore, I would argue that to the extent that HP and AP require the mobilization of different, even conflicting resources, it becomes difficult to support the view that these can be considered the same emotion, at least in the sense of sameness that they use. So, moving on to another emotion, disgust. Disgust was initially a basic emotion calibrated to avoid ingestion or contact with toxins and parasites, but was co-opted via natural or cultural selection to play other functions. So sexual disgust, for example, functions to avoid mating with incompatible, infected, or low fitness partners. For example, it fluctuates according to reproductive status in females. Moral disgust functions to stigmatize and exclude norm violators, especially with respect to disgust-related violations, sexual acts, violence, exploitation, social parasitism. And finally, intergroup disgust, which functions to solidify relations between in-group members and to denigrate or alas exterminate out-group members posing a perceived threat. Again, the different forms of disgust have retained the features of primary disgust in a number of ways: expression, behavior, physiology, neural basis, and so on. This presents a strong case for homology between basic disgust and these other forms of disgust. Nevertheless, by all appearances and on most accounts, basic forms of disgust continue to exist and function relatively independently alongside the other forms. So let me stop there and see if there are any questions so far. Oh, okay. So how do I think we should solve this problem? All of these persistences of basic forms, despite the emergence of higher cognitive forms, pose the persistence problem, especially if it's interpreted in terms of transformational homologies, what I called single trait homology, what Dan Fessler and I call refinement. An ancestral trait is transformed into a derived trait, again, via a continuous series of modifications. The ancestral and derived trait are still the same trait. The original trait is no longer present in its ancestral form. So this is the standard solution in emotion research. ancestral trait don't continue to persist independently. Instead, what we have is a single trait with, say, an expanded set of elicitors and behavioral responses and cognitive integration and so on. Now, one way to preserve the idea that motivates the view that we should retain basic emotions, namely that we need quick and dirty responses, is to argue that certain stimuli have privileged strength, are more directly connected to particular responses, and so on. And in this case, the apparent persistence of emotions can be explained, say, in terms of graded response continuum resulting from standard processes of transformational homology. I think this is a potentially viable solution. I don't reject it out of hand, but to the extent that these forms require the mobilization of different, even conflicting resources, and result in different, often opposing consequences, the standard solution seems improbable to me. An interpretation of the relationships between such forms in terms of serial homology avoids this problem. The ancestral emotions are duplicated, and the duplicates are allowed to vary in response to new contexts and selected pressures. Some objections to the serial homology interpretation. First objection: serial homology is a somewhat exotic and controversial concept and should be avoided if possible. Response: controversy is mainly limited to methodological and definitional conflicts with various taxic and cladistic accounts of homology, but I don't think they pose a serious problem to the concept itself. Furthermore, serial homology is and is increasingly recognized as a central evolutionary process at all levels of analysis. Molecules are duplicated in evolution and put to new uses. Serotonin, for example, is a gut hormone that's been reproduced and reused in the brain. Oxytocin, originally associated with lactation and birth, has come to be associated with mother-infant bonding and pair bonding, social bonding more generally. Genes are very often duplicated. These duplicates can either provide redundant augmentation, the function of the original gene, or they can vary in different genetic contexts. So in virtue of being in proximity to certain other genes or certain sequences of genetic information, they can change their function despite being essentially the same gene. Developmental pathways can be duplicated for different traits, and we'll see this a little bit when we talk about emotions. Anatomical structures, that's obvious. Physiological processes, behavior. What does it mean, serial homology of behavior? Well, consider pecking behavior within the mating display of Sybarite chickens. Originally, this pecking behavior is associated obviously with eating food. Later, it comes to be associated with attracting females, so it gets incorporated into the display. The chickens will, for example, make food calls when they're pecking at the food if there is a female present. If there's not, they don't make food calls. And this illustrates sort of a general principle of serial homologies of behavior, and probably other levels too. It's what West Eberhard calls sensory traps, which means essentially that these behaviors are antecedently well suited to function in that context, or have a function that can augment the new function. Pecking behavior, for example, attracts females because of the presence of food to begin with. So the fact that pecking behavior is incorporated into the mating display, which is, after all, geared toward attracting females, is no real surprise. And finally, functions can also be duplicated. Furthermore, in response to the objection, many features of emotions are already essentially explained in terms of serial homology, though not explicitly so. So emotional expressions are widely thought to have originally been functionally significant. So baring the teeth helps you to prepare to bite and to attack. Later this evolves into sort of a bluff signal or social signal. And even later in humans, comes to play a more significant communicative role as faces become more important for emotional communication in humans. And probably these expressions have been duplicated and modified in numerous ways, numerous times. And it's important to see here that the original function of the expression is often retained. Humans generally aren't in the business of biting other humans, but if they were to bite other humans, baring of the teeth would be a good way to start. So a second objection. This one I think is a little bit more serious. It's unclear what is meant by serial homologies of psychological traits. And psychological traits seem to pose special problems for an interpretation in terms of serial homology. For example, the neural structures that underpin psychological traits certainly do not appear to have been duplicated. My response, true enough, but it's too early to reject the possibility, given that it's been massively understudied. Also remember that homologies may diverge at multiple levels, so this means, in particular, that psychological traits need not have the same neural basis. So a duplicated trait can come to rely on different functional circuits or regions of the brain, despite being the same trait and despite even playing the same function. So which aspects of emotions have been duplicated? And here I enter into pretty much, well, not pure speculation, but intense speculation. This hasn't really been considered. At one extreme, the expressive features alone are duplicated. This is uncontroversial. It's the same sort of story about pecking behavior, right? The other extreme, the entire emotion could be duplicated in new contexts. And I won't list every piecemeal decompositional possibility in between, right? Any subset of the features might be duplicated in new contexts. So what might it look like if the entire emotion were duplicated? An intriguing and suggestive experiment by Bach in 1988 gives us one way of thinking about this. So in this experiment, they trained particular individuals to be able to manipulate a set of levers in a really complex sequence, and that would result in the presentation of food. These are the only individuals that knew how to do that. Initially, when they were able to do this, dominants would come and take all the food right away. But the specially trained individuals would basically start to pout and would refuse to perform the trick to get food. This led to other individuals, even dominants, showing them an unusual degree of deference. For example, if they performed the trick and got food, then the dominants would allow them to have some first. Furthermore, other members of the group, again including dominants, showed them unusual affiliation, right? They would groom them more often or be near them more often than they would have otherwise. So, importantly, however, the dominance-based rank of the subordinate did not change as a result. So, among other things, this experiment indicates that many non-humans can engage in skill ranking of conspecifics and discriminatory deference. But despite the fact that their dominance rank did not change, deference and affiliation are two key ways in which prestige-based status differs from dominance, and the increase in such behaviors toward the individual suggests that they possessed a precursor form of prestige-based status. So, it's easy to imagine that here or at some nearby point in evolution, individuals began experiencing and expressing an existing dominance-related emotion in response to non-dominance forms of status. In other words, they began expressing basic pride in these contexts as a result of being awarded status. So, with increasing reliance on prestige-based status dynamics, the emotion may then be transformed in response to the new context under the influence of distinct selective pressures related to prestige, for example, or proto-prestige. But the original dominance-related responses remain in place and function largely as before in the original context. So, for example, lack of need to dominate others to achieve this kind of status and the more affiliative social consequences of this form of status might gradually eliminate the need for the aggressive components of the response, including physiological components, for example. Okay. This could result in transformations of these emotions at a wide variety of levels. I know what you're all thinking, and I'm going to admit it, this is a highly speculative just-so story. The example here is meant to be merely suggestive, primarily suggestive. There are some ways that we might be able to test and replicate Stambach's experiment. And as far as I know, as far as any of the primatologists I've asked know, this experiment has never been replicated. Although Victoria Herner is doing some work related to this. Apparently she's got an unpublished paper on it that she's hiding away. I haven't been able to see it, but she's done work with chimps who can imitate, for example, and shown social learning of the same kind of manipulative skills that macaques were trained to have. But these are, especially in chimps, this doesn't get very far off the ground, right? You train a chimp to manipulate a machine to get food. The other chimps are able to figure out what's going on and do it themselves, so there's nowhere for prestige to kind of get a hold because the information is copied. But we could begin to test Stambach's ideas by running experiments where there's an increased reliance of the group on skilled individuals. So what if the specially trained monkey was the only monkey who could get food for the group at all? Could also do it over a longer time period. Stambach's experiment was pretty short, so the social dynamics associated with it probably didn't have a chance to set in. And finally, we could replicate it with chimps or bonobos who do possess imitation abilities. I mentioned Herner's work. She hasn't directly tested the kind of situation where the specially skilled individual is the only one, for example, who can get food. I would argue that this possibility is supported by some of the developmental trajectories of emotions like shame and pride. First of all, the developmental progression of these emotions supports the general claims of homology that I started with. It also supports the persistence of basic forms and the serial homology interpretation of these relationships. So, for example, according to Michael Lewis, these emotions emerge in at least 3 stages, or emotions emerge in at least three stages. You have basic emotions, self-evaluative, and evaluative emotions. The basic emotions emerge at various points during the first year. Self-conscious emotions, like shame and pride, emerge in 2 stages. About 15 to 24 months, you get what Lewis calls the self-exposed emotions. These appear as a result of the child having some relatively crude sense of self or self-consciousness, the idea of being seen as an object in others' eyes. So, for example, just being the center of attention. And these include, according to Lewis, empathy and envy. Between 2 and 4 years, children develop a more sophisticated sense of self, and become capable of internalizing norms and evaluating their behavior in terms of them, as opposed to simply responding to others' evaluations of their behavior. And this gives rise to what Lewis calls the self-evaluative emotions, which involve complex cognition about the self as an object that can be evaluated in the eyes of others according to both internal and external standards. These emotions include guilt, shame, and pride. To look at shame a little bit more closely, Lewis, to remind you, it's an evaluative self-conscious emotion, says that shame arises out of a simpler form of embarrassment, an exposed self-conscious emotion. So he identifies 2 forms of embarrassment. First, non-evaluative embarrassment is a self-exposed emotion, hence relatively simpler, occurring when the individual becomes aware of being the center of attention, positive or negative. Requires only a basic awareness of the self as an object. Evaluative embarrassment is a full-blown self-evaluative emotion, and thus requires more sophisticated forms of cognition, theory of mind, mind reading, and so on, such that the individual be aware that others are evaluating the self or its actions, that these norms are internalized in the agent, etc. Shame, in turn, is seen as growing out of, or being a special variety of, evaluative embarrassment, distinguished by its intensity. I don't know that I agree with that, but for the purpose of the example, we'll stick with it. Importantly, for present purposes, according to Lewis, adults remain capable of responses at all of these levels. So he gives the example of, when he's talking about this in lectures, he says, I'm going to close my eyes and point randomly to one of you. Whoever gets pointed to in the lecture invariably starts to show signs of embarrassment, despite the fact that they've been picked completely randomly, and not by any evaluative process. Similar patterns also characterize pride. Children's early forms of pride are relatively indiscriminate with respect to the role of self. They'll show pride simply by winning in a game of chance. And attributions tend to be of the hubristic pride type, stable, global, rather than unstable, effort-based features. Furthermore, hierarchical social dynamics in young children are primarily based on dominance, with a transition to prestige-based dynamics occurring later. This general pattern of developmental progressions is advocated by numerous developmental theories. Brian Parkinson, Vasudevi Reddy, Mascolo, Harkins, Fisher, Barrett, and so on. So it's not a one-off to Lewis. So, we return to the second part of the second objection to the serial homology interpretation. Any theory of serial homologies of psychological traits must provide an account of the neural basis of such processes. How might this be done? I'm running out of time, so I might move kind of quickly here. Anatomical duplication of neural structures. This is possible in some cases, for example, duplication of cortical layers as an evolutionary process, duplication of spatial motor maps in the brain using one as a template for the other. But anatomical duplications appear to be rare, and in any case, this can't be a general fundamental principle underlying serial homologies of psychological traits, and for obvious reasons. Brain size is under tight evolutionary constraints, and it's already maxed out. A second option, traits can be duplicated via functional migration, sometimes called encephalization. And in this process, functions originally mediated by one, usually lower brain structure, are duplicated in other, usually higher brain structures. Sometimes this can occur as adaptive stabilizing redundancy. However, the higher area may subsequently take over and or modify the function of the lower regions, often resulting in rewiring of the lower area. This is a possibility. Seems to happen in relationships between the amygdala and other subcortical emotional structures and the orbital frontal cortex. And maybe we can talk about that in discussion if people have questions. But again, this seems to be relatively uncommon. Finally, neural reuse. If you're interested in this, there's a great review paper by Michael Anderson in BBS 2010 that discusses a lot of these different theories. This has been variously called neural exploitation, recycling, redeployment, sharing, and so on. And the basic idea of it is that brain regions can continue to acquire new uses after an initial or original function is established. The acquisition of new uses need not involve much local change to circuit structure. For example, it might involve only a connection of the establishment of connections to new neural partners, although such changes are possible. In other words, the original structure can also vary. So this kind of neural reuse, where the original function is preserved, is essentially a form of serial homology. It's reuse of the neural tissues. If the function is augmented by stabilizing redundancy, you get functional serial homology and so on. So that's important, again, to recall the distinction between adaptive and non-adaptive senses of function. In terms of trying to provide a neural basis for serial homologies of psychological traits, this is where it's at. It's possible to extend it to a more general principle of brain function. So one of the fundamental principles guiding reuse is the presence of a sufficient degree of functional relatedness between existing and newly developing uses. And this might exploit various aspects of the original region through multiple mechanisms at multiple scales and levels of organization. So in the same way that certain behaviors constitute sensory traps or are antecedently well suited for different contexts, physiological properties, computational properties, pre-existing connectivity, basic circuit properties, complex nested circuits of various levels can all constitute, trying to avoid this word, but a pre-adaptation for the new function. In other words, just meaning that they're already well suited to play that function. Let's see. One way of conceptualizing reuse is sort of conceptual metaphor of blending theories. This is the idea that cognition is dominated by metaphor-based thinking, where the structure, model, or models of one or more domains are combined in various ways to structure thinking in another. The slogan is sometimes the vehicles of thought are reactivated perceptual representations. Examples: spatial metaphors for time, timelines, motor control for language, speech and thought sequencing, motor control for memory, using phonological loops, semantic grounding, using your fingers for counting, and so on. Personally, when I'm writing, I think primarily in terms of sculptural metaphors involving hammers, chisels, and brushes. This can be hard on my computer. And unfortunately, if this talk was a sculpture, it would look something like this. Actually, I flatter myself, but so Gallese and Lakoff have proposed that understanding requires imagination. Imagination involves simulation. So seeing somebody reach for a cup and understanding that involves the activation of mirror neurons in the observer. And many of these regions are also activated when the individual performs that act themselves. So this is a form of neural reuse. DeHaan, I'll skip that. So most accounts of neural reuse are centered around the relationship between sensory motor regions and cognitive functions, especially vision. What about possible reuse underlying emotions? And here I draw from Alan Fisk's commentary in the Anderson article. What about movement for emotional valence, approach, avoidance, positive, negative, compassion and admiration, neural reuse between a social and somatosensory system, whereby systems for feeling physical pain and socio-emotional pain overlap. Comparative status, the interparietal sulcus, which is involved in representing comparative numerosity and quantity, etc., is also involved in representing status hierarchy. Finally, reuse and mapping of visceral and somatosensory regions. For example, the insula in humans contains a third or maybe fourth or fifth order map of the visceral body not found in other primates. I got started late, so I'm going to take an extra 3 minutes. Furthermore, what I've been thinking about lately in terms of reuse and serial homology is co-optation and modification of olfactory and gustatory regions. For example, in the evolution of disgust. Human loss of olfaction is prima facie puzzling given some of the selective pressures that they faced in the EEA. For example, changes in human diet, increase in meat, result in significantly increased exposure to toxins and parasites. Explanations of loss of olfaction in terms of visual dominance, I think, can only be part of the story. Perhaps reuse of olfactory regions to support other forms of learning and behavior compensated for these losses. For example, the cognitive appraisal structure, behavioral responses, and metaphorical language surrounding derived forms of disgust are highly similar to those involving olfaction and gustation. So, I mean, moral disgust or intergroup disgust and so on, rejecting, expelling, avoidance, contamination, containment, cleansing, bad taste, and so on. All of these responses and sort of olfactory concepts seem like they're well suited for redeployment in social context. These regions of the brain, especially the olfactory ones, may underlie an even more general and comprehensive account of neural reuse and emotion. Many socio-emotional processes in other animals are connected to olfaction. Reproductive status, dominant status, immune status, parasitic infection, genetic compatibility, genetic fitness, individual recognition, aggression, and could go on. Most of these are primarily mediated by the accessory olfactory system, the vomeronasal organ. More generally, the concept of the limbic system as a general mediator of emotion has long been tightly coupled with olfactory gustatory brain structure and processes, for example, in the concept of the rhinencephalon or nose brain. Olfactory regions, especially in other mammals and even in humans, have highly privileged access to structures involved in emotion. Indeed, many key regions involved in emotion and memory appear to have actually evolved out of what were originally olfactory or gustatory cortices. The hippocampus evolved out of olfactory cortex, possibly the amygdala. The insula contains gustatory somatosensory regions, medial prefrontal cortex, and orbital frontal cortex. All of these, maybe with the exception of the amygdala, are already involved in assigning value, valence, reward value, and so on. So they're already set up to evaluate stimuli in those terms. In humans, these regions continue to be involved in those processes, but taste and smell have undergone significant reductions. We've lost the vomeronasal organ. Pheromonal communication has also been lost or greatly attenuated. So sensitivity to both social and sensory olfactory cues has been greatly reduced as a result of loss of receptor genes and probably central processing resources. So mice have somewhere around 1,000 receptor genes, which, fascinatingly enough, map one-to-one to receptor types, I'm told. So olfaction is a lot more complicated than you may have learned in your introductory neuroscience courses. In humans, the number is around 300. And the other genes having become pseudogenes. However, increased memory capacity of the language may have compensated for this to some extent. Humans rely on those more than their nose itself. So, finishing up, there's evidence that portions of olfactory gustatory brain regions have been redeployed to support limbic and memory functions more generally, in virtue of possessing physiological, connectional, computational properties that are antecedently well suited to perform emotional functions. To the extent that this is true, human loss of olfactory functions may have been compensated for by reusing the relevant regions to mediate much more general, sophisticated, and flexible socio-emotional abilities. Indeed, given how much of the brain of early mammals was originally dedicated to olfaction, reuse of olfactory cortices may be the single largest redeployment of tissue in the mammalian brain. So, conclusion. In one sense, all of this is no big deal. The serial homology interpretation just provides a more accurate terminology for patterns and processes that are already well recognized. However, recognizing such phenomena allows researchers to tap into a rich tradition of evolutionary research and classification that has largely been neglected in the literature. While not limited to developmental homologies, which is another neglected category, serial homology directs us to consider developmental factors. Also, and maybe most importantly, the failure to consider serial homology interpretations of many phenomena generates unnecessary conceptual tangles and confusions, resulting in wasted debates and conceptual contortionism and gymnastics. For example, the sharp division between basic and higher cognitive emotions is tangled up with this. Maybe the facet interpretation is more complex than it needs to be. We'll have to see. So that's it. I'm happy to meet with people one-on-one. Also want to let you know that that David Moore from Claremont Graduate University might be coming to visit. If you're interested in serial homology, you might want to meet with him while he's here, or meet with us while we're here. He's especially interested in developmental homology issues. All right, let the blood sport begin.